Galung Muru Pindavu, Kurumba Biji. All right. So you're probably wondering what I'm doing with the child's toy. Okay. So that sound very much mimics the sound of that bull roar, which is an instrument that is used by Aboriginal Australian people as a tool when they use it for rituals. Now, in other cultures, that bull roar is also used as a different tool, as a communication tool. Okay, it's also used for rituals, but it's used to signal people entering another location in essence. So what I'm doing here is basically, as an uncultural, utilizing a tool that is recognizable by Aboriginal people Australia as something that is, that they're used to. So I'm signaling my entry to the land of Turrbal and Yagara people. And the idea is that that sound is almost like good tidings. And again, any group of people who enters a land by wearing bells generally loses its element of surprise. So it's basically a friendly gesture in anything. All right. So that's my way of acknowledging country. It's different. It might not be optimal, but it's not also offensive. All right. So I'm trying to develop my own way of acknowledging country as opposed to reading off a script. So which there's nothing wrong with that. But anyway, but it ties in with what I'm doing in this talk as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is really present a think piece on cultural metacognition. And I could see why Christine and Yolanda sort of put us together in this talk, because it links together quite well. All right. So what I want to, again, present really is how metacognition helps us to behave appropriately in different cultures. Okay. So I'll start talking about the idea of cultural intelligence and how that links to culture. Okay, and I want to use interdisciplinary ideas from social psychology and sociology to present culture as hybrid systems, right? And also the idea that culture can be used as action strategies for us to help function in different cultures, basically, all right? And I'll share some cultural action strategies to see how this metaphor works, and then pretty much talk about how metacognition actually works as well, right? So in a way, it's me trying to unpack the cultural metacognition aspect, okay? And then I'll end up with propositions about cultural metacognition as being a large, well-stocked, well-organized, and well-illuminated tool shed. All right, so why do I need a piece on cultural metacognition? Basically, it's because the idea that since the advent of cultural intelligence, or the popularization of cultural intelligence since the early 2000s, okay, there's two camps, the early camp and the Thomas camp. I come from the Thomas camp. This concept has been used numerous times, right, heaps in publication and literature, but the central component of cultural intelligence, which is cultural metacognition, has not gone beyond the idea that it's a conscious cultural awareness, or that it has a linking function for cultural intelligence, or that it gets developed through reflection, right? So it's just basically, okay, we've got this cultural metacognition and it links all the elements of cultural intelligence together, but we haven't gone beyond that. How does it actually work? How do people use it, for example? Right. So, and again, one of the reasons why I think it's important for us to think about this is that many individuals struggle to actually internalize culture, let alone use the different cultures that they have, right, in everyday life. So in essence, many struggle to manage the knowledge and skills that they have from different cultures. Okay. And again, to use it to function effectively in different cultures as well. Okay, so again, in essence, it is trying to unpack this black box that is called cultural metacognition. So again, I think what I want to do here also is share complementary ideas about culture, right? And almost think about those ideas to help us, to help people think about this cultural metacognition aspect. Okay, so just to step back a little bit, but maybe after Alex's talk, we don't need to. Concept of culture, right? So according to Thomas et al., cultural intelligence is really the system of interacting knowledge, skills that are linked by cultural metacognition, right? That allows people to adapt, select, use information, use knowledge, skills to function effectively in different cultures. So again, what's interesting here is that this is viewed as an element, right, that brings all that together. So the descriptions of cultural metacognition has been described as being a system, right, set of capabilities, right, something that gathers information, knowledge together, interpret the knowledge and skills, right, monitor that information, for example, then based on that, develop behaviors that can be used in different cultures, for example, okay? So in essence, cultural metacognition is this element that links all that together, right? So that's the description of cultural metacognition. Now, I want to suggest really just a working definition of culture, which has been, in some ways, you know, there's a consensus in sociology, in organizational psychology, as well as in social psychology, that culture is a construct, a shared construct, right? That consists of things like patterns, symbols, for example, expectations that are understood by members of different cultures or a particular culture. Now, social psychology as a discipline argues that the primary function of culture is quite universal, namely is to provide solution sets for people, okay, for addressing basic problems such as survival, sustaining a group, and organizing the group, right, to facilitate individual welfare as well as the group, right? So again, I think from a social psychology perspective, this is useful in the sense that every culture does sort of have that within them, okay, that solve problems within that culture. And now what we want to see is how do we use that in different culture? How does that translate to different cultures, basically? Now, there are criticisms about viewing culture as a unified system that is used by people as a framework, right? A unified framework to guide actions. Sociologists argue that it may not be that simple, right? It might be that culture is a system where it serves as a criterion or almost a guide for people to behave a certain way. Now, as a guide, there might be different ways of doing things in essence, okay? So this is really the idea of sociologists also borrow biologists' view of the open and closed system, right? So sociologists basically make the argument cultures can be open systems and closed systems. So if we think about culture as a system, then it has boundary conditions. In other words, the solution sets for one culture, right, could be used for another, right? But within a particular culture, there may also be solution sets that are strictly for that culture or utilize certain solution sets with no other alternatives, for example, okay? So in keeping that in mind, the boundary condition suggests that there are some rules that are necessary to serve certain problems in closed systems, but there are also others that are open systems, which have variations of solutions. So from a biological perspective, systems, open systems particularly, exhibit principles of equifinality, right? This is the idea that solutions may have variations. So a solution to a problem may have multiple variations in essence, okay? So that pertains to society. Now, I want to use this idea of the equifinality aspect to think about cultural metacognition and how we use cultural metacognition to help us function in different cultures, right? So sociologists also view culture possibly as being hybrid systems. They don't necessarily say that. I'll transpose their ideas and suggest that cultures are hybrid systems, right? And in essence, if you think about culture as a closed system, this is where cultures during stable times become closed in the sense that the ways of doing things become normalized, and people, almost have one view of looking at things. However, culture can be also viewed as open system during times of change, right? And we see that in societies, we see that in nations that are changing, for example, right? During turbulent times, okay? So if we look at that as a way of looking at cultures, then there's a complementary view from sociologists that cultures also resemble toolkit of action strategies. Okay, and I mentioned that before. And again, the idea here is that to use the strategies as ways to support attaining a goal. Okay, and sociologists such as Grozov and Drazen suggest that any particular structure may have multiple functions, and any function may be fulfilled by alternative structures or processes. The idea here is that if you have a solution that is supported by a structure, that structure can be used to solve other problems, basically, okay, in simple terms. All right, so then if we accept the idea that cultures are in effect action strategies, then it opens the possibility for us to utilize different tools, different solution sets to solve a particular problem or multiple problems, basically, right? So again, what I'm trying to suggest here is that this functional equivalence idea is useful to unpack or apply to cultural metacognition. All right, so some practical examples, right, in terms of applying cultures as toolkits. So this is what we call a box wrench or closed-end wrench. Okay, and the function of this is to loosen or tighten a hexagonal nut on a rod or on basically a bolt. Okay, so if you see the hexagonal nut, this closed-end wrench is the optimal tool for that purpose, for that function, in that it actually grips the 6 sides of the hexagonal nut as well as the 6 sort of angles. Now, we can actually loosen or tighten that hexagonal nut using an adjustable wrench or apply a wrench. However, it's not optimal in the sense that there are open spaces, right? And the grip basically can be loose, okay? Which then strips the hexagonal nut. So it's not an optimal tool, but it is a tool that can be used, okay? So in my view here, this resembles an open system where the function of something, right, can be achieved by other tools. Now consider the spark plug, which is something like that, right? It also has a structure. It has a hexagonal nut structure right in the middle. Now, those of you that know a little bit about cars or where spark plugs fit, know that this fits in the engine, right? This part fits in the engine, and this part is outside of the engine. Now, if you look at an engine, right, that's how the spark plug fits, right? So something like this more, right? So there's no room for us to use these tools here, okay? So the only tool that can tighten or loosen a spark plug is the spark plug wrench, okay? And that's just an example of a closed system in essence, right? You have one tool for that purpose, and you can't really use another tool for that, okay? And in cultures, in my view here, there are certain elements there in cultures that also exist in that way, okay? So how does this apply in cultures, right? We've seen it as a tool, a real tool in an engine, but how does it apply to cultures as we know? So I want to share an example of communication in essence, right? In my research of communication, we found basically that communication has 2 primary functions in society, right? So one is to reduce uncertainty, and the other one is to develop affiliation between interactors, to develop relationships, basically, okay? So the function of reduction of uncertainty can be achieved by using multiple structures and tools, such as using language, or we could use tools such as visual tools, nonverbal tools, non-visual tools to actually reduce uncertainty in a message, in essence, right? So we could use multiple combinations of printed words or visual information, right? So we could use text, which is a combination of visual and verbal structures, or we could have words and pictures, which is a combination of text, right, visual and also nonverbal structures, okay? Now, the function of affiliation can be achieved by similar tools, including time and activities dimension, right? I'm going to propose basically for us to develop a relationship, we communicate, but there's also an element of time added to that, where affiliation actually gets developed through multiple times, multiple interactions, basically, okay? Now, the argument I'm going to make here in affiliation, right, you could also reduce uncertainty. So, for example, people use activities such as golfing or fishing, for example, in business interactions to develop this affiliation. And again, the argument I'm making here is that if you do that, then you could do both. You could reduce uncertainty of what you're planning to do in business, for example, through the conversation. And you could also develop affiliation depending on what you talk about, in essence. All right, so we've got basically a function and also tools to actually develop that function. Now, in my view here, that the different action strategies become relevant when we're dealing with different cultures. Okay, I want to give an example in terms of communication as well. Okay, so one of the things that we found in research in relation to collectivistic high context culture, right, or cultures, is that the affiliation function is prioritized. In other words, when we're meeting somebody for the first time in business, for example, right, the relationship is important. Now, in terms of developing that relationship, there might be multiple action strategies that can be used, such as gift-giving, right, using politeness strategies, honorific, for example, right, or harmony maintenance behavior, right? So holistic approaches and other non-task activity approaches, in essence, okay? So, for example, in Japan, right, which is a collectivistic high context culture, the affiliation strategy is, prioritized. And they tend to also have this action strategy where giving is important, right? And in particular, a wrap gift and politeness is used as an affiliation strategy initially, okay? And what's interesting is, again, research suggests that the wrap gift, the wrapping of a gift has numerous symbolic meanings in Japanese cultures. So the wrapping is important, right? And it tells us how we value the person and also the relationship. Now, in contrast, in China, which is also a collectivistic high context culture, gifting is also an important part of this affiliation action strategy. But the gift wrap, right, do not have the same symbolic meaning as in Japanese cultures. So that you can give a gift without wrapping, or basically you can give different forms of gifts in the two cultures, okay? Simple example, all right? Wrapping is important. The one on the left is the one I wrapped for my son. The one on the right is the one my wife did for my daughter. Both of them have books inside. Now, the Japanese would view this one on the right that my wife did as being more valuable. Okay, as a joke. But again, you get the idea that that wrapping has a symbolic meaning of thought and care to the gift. All right. So now we come down to basically a cultural metacognition. Based on that discussion about culture and cultural intelligence, how does this all relate to cultural metacognition, right? So Flavel, who talks about metacognition, basically suggests that metacognition involves 4 classes of phenomena, right? You got knowledge, you got experience, you got goals and actions, okay? So in short, what metacognition does is actually utilize the knowledge that we have and experience that we have to form action strategies to achieve a goal, right? So when we're talking about cultural metacognition, if we extend Triandis's view about cultural metacognition, then it's a process of thinking about cultures, different cultures, right? And to utilize it to develop behaviors, to develop action strategies, for example, as one learns new cultures or as one applies it to different cultures, okay? So Thomas et al. Proposed that this cultural metacognition dimension is the core of cultural intelligence, okay? All right, so this sort of ends up with a number of propositions for me, basically, and in relation to the cultural metacognition of multiculturals or enculturals, okay? So that it is large, it's well stocked, it's well organized, and it's well illuminated, okay? Now, I know metaphors have its limitations, but humor me a little bit, because I think it's a useful way for people who are struggling to integrate cultures to actually utilize their cultural experiences, okay? So first of all, the toolshed is large in the sense that this picture we could see is relatively large, right? So it's got the capacity to store multiple action strategies, but also the space to play around with it. So we think about cultural metacognition as a space to play around with cultural action strategies, behaviors, etc. in the mind, then it's helpful to look at it in this way. It's also well stocked. So apart from having the space, we could see also that multiculturals or enculturals have the experience to develop action strategies, different cultural schemas, for example, from their cultural experiences, in essence, okay? So it's well stocked in that sense. And my argument here is that the multicultural metacognition is also well organized in the sense that as one learns a new strategy and reflects on that strategy, one also develops connections with other strategies that they have in the past or other knowledge structures that they have in their minds, in essence, okay? So again, my argument here is that cognitively what happens is that multiculturals, when they learn a new strategy, they almost think about, how does this relate to my existing strategy? How can I use this strategy, for example, in another culture? Yes, there is a condition there. You do have to reflect upon it, okay? And finally, that it's well illuminated, right? In other words, the excellent organization and the excellent maintenance system I talked about just now allows the individual to be able to see the different types of action strategies they have in their tool shed and how those action strategies link to one another and how it could be used to serve different functions in different cultures as well, okay? And again, the argument I'm making here in terms of the well-illuminated tool shed is that enculturals or multiculturals do tend to develop the skill where they do think about different action strategies and how they link to each other, right? And from cognitive study, we know that if we activate knowledge structures, even if it's in the recesses of our mind, and then we sort of regularly activate it, then it's easier to access, basically. In essence, our minds know where we can get at it, okay? Just like the tool shed. Again, so what I'm suggesting also here, the organization, the person has a place for everything. And again, even the drawers would be labeled so that they know what's inside, okay? All right, so one last proposition is basically that the multicultural metacognition will have an active in their foreground facility, right? Multiple action strategies, knowledge of their functional equivalences to attain goals in different cultures, for example, and knowledge of goals in multiple cultures as well, okay? And I'll end acknowledging the limitation of metaphors. Metaphors are used to really just to provide a way of thinking about something that's complex. So it will focus on few elements, but it will neglect other elements as well. Okay, so most people acknowledge that, but I've had people sort of bang their table and say, this just doesn't work. It's just too simplistic. Well, it is, but it's useful for people who are struggling to internalize their culture, to actually think about it in that way. And again, in my defense, I'm going to show you the toolshed of a Formula One racing car team, right? If we look at this as the epitome of a toolshed, right, then you could argue that, the cultural metacognition of, well, multicultural might look like something like this, okay? Before and after, it is pristine. And again, the argument here is that even in the busiest time, right, in a Formula One car team toolshed, when people use the tool, they'll put it back where it is, because it requires that the team knows exactly where that tool is to use it every second, right, during the busiest time, in essence. Okay. All right, that's all I have. Thank you for your interest and questions or comments. Thank you.